Sup guys, and don't mind me, I'm just taking on some new lifestyle changes. I've decided to completely stop looking forward to my future, and to represent that, I decided I'm just gonna literally look backwards instead. So, I'm just gonna sit here looking backwards while I read the dictionary definition of my favorite word, compatible. Coexist.
Hey, you just got a brand new console. A gateway full of brand new video game experiences has been opened up to you. So what are you gonna play first? I should have just bought Sing Party instead. Backwards compatibility, the art of shoehorning unnecessary hardware into new consoles just so you can play your old shit. Backwards compatibility is one of my favorite things about getting a new video game console. Having this shiny new piece of hardware that not only plays new games but also your entire library of old games is simply magical. But unfortunately, that concept means nothing to the companies actually developing these consoles because backwards compatibility is such a rare commodity to see sometimes. There's nothing worse in my opinion than hoping for an upcoming console to become the ultimate video game machine, only to have those hopes dashed when said company doesn't give you exactly what you want. It's really baffling to me that backwards compatibility isn't more of a thing. Sure, adding the capability to play old games into the console hardware is probably too much of a hassle in the company's eyes, but it just really rubs me the wrong way when an entire console's library is made obsolete just because this newer piece of technology doesn't support it. Now to be fair, in the general consumer's eyes, they don't give a shit. Most people buy new consoles to play new games, so because of that, you don't really see backwards compatibility as a selling point. Even so, and despite how underutilized it is, I still love backwards compatibility. So to celebrate that, let's go through the highs, lows, and histories of backwards compatibility, starting with the first console that ever had it, the Atari 7800. Because who wants to play garbage when you can play fucking garbage? The Atari 7800 was the first console to ever have backwards compatibility built in. Prior to this, consoles would use adapters to allow consumers to play their old games on newer devices, like with the Atari 5200, because I guess Atari was just too stupid to realize that people might actually want to play their 2600 games on their new 5200. It's kind of baffling it took Atari so long to build backwards compatibility into their consoles, considering they were one of the few companies actually putting out multiple consoles at the time. There wasn't a massive power leap between said consoles, and especially because their competitors, the Intellivision and ColecoVision, ended up releasing adapters for people to play 2600 games on their own hardware. Hey, it might be illegal, but at least it's funny. So in response to that, Atari decided to create an adapter to play 2600 games on the 5200. Nobody cared, the 5200 flopped, the video game market crashed in 1983, and Atari then struck back in 1986 with the Atari 7800, which was fully backwards compatible with nearly all 2600 games. Not with any 5200 games, cry about it.
I hate numbers.
So the 7800 had full backwards compatibility with nearly all 2600 games, but really, what was the point? The NES was already out by the time the 7800 released, so who cared about playing Atari games at that point, especially when 2600 games were nearing a decade old. While the 7200 was revolutionary in having built-in backwards compatibility, it didn't make much of an impact, and after this, most companies stuck to adapters for a while, like with the Sega Genesis. Believe it or not, but Sega actually had a console prior to the Genesis titled the Sega Master System. The Master System released in 1985 in Japan and kind of flopped in all territories besides Brazil due to a lacking game library. So naturally, Sega decided to make an adapter for the Genesis to play Master System games because I just really need to play Alex Kidd, okay? The Power Base Converter released in 1989 and allowed you to play Master System games on your Sega Genesis, but only on the original model for some reason. A redesigned converter specifically to be used on the Genesis Model 2 was released only in Europe in 1993, but the Model 3 was f***ed from the start. Moving on to the competitor of the Genesis, the Super Nintendo had zero backwards compatibility built in for NES games. There were some early plans to allow NES games to be played on the SNES, but they never fell through for whatever reason. That didn't stop me from believing the SNES was backwards compatible as a kid though. I mean, come on, can you blame me? You're telling me this console called the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, a sequel to a console called the Nintendo Entertainment System, can't play games one generation prior? It has Super in the name for God's sakes, that almost always means better, but I guess the SNES isn't better enough to play games released less than 5 years ago. It's 2021 and I'm still pissed. Well, even though the SNES can't play NES games, there were some ways to play old games on this thing. The Super Game Boy and Super Game Boy 2 allowed you to play Game Boy games on a big CRT TV, but sadly you can't play Game Boy Color games on either model due to them both releasing before the Color's release. You'd think Nintendo would have delayed the Super Game Boy 2 to allow Game Boy Color support considering the two released the same year. But that's Nintendo for you, why go with a logical and more consumer appealing option when we can be stupid? Anyway, the Super Game Boy is a really cool accessory. It arguably doesn't count as backwards compatibility, but it's still neat to play these Game Boy games on a screen that's bigger than a couple of grapes. In the end, however, this was about as much backwards compatibility the SNES got, and as video games began to shift away from the 16-bit generation, things started to look dire in the world of backwards compatibility. In the late 90s, video games began to shift over to CD-based formats, meaning there was no easy way to allow for backwards compatibility with cartridge-based games without going completely out of the way to do so. I mean, the Sega Saturn did have a cartridge slot exclusively for memory cards, but it's the Sega Saturn, who gives a shit? Well, at least the Nintendo 64 stuck with cartridges this generation, so surely they could allow for SNES support. I can't even finish that, of course they didn't do it. You could play Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow on the N64 through the Transfer Pack and Pokemon Stadium. Not any other Game Boy games though, that's kind of raw. Well, at least most handhelds were backwards compatible at this point. The Game Boy Color could play Game Boy games, all WonderSwans could play WonderSwan games, the Neo Geo Pocket Color played Neo Geo Pocket games, and while these are all pretty cool additions, they're not very exciting. There wasn't a massive hardware leap between these handhelds and their successors, so it doesn't really hit as hard as, say, being able to play Master System games on your Genesis, for instance. Saying the Game Boy Color could play Game Boy games is like saying this ice is backwards compatible with water, like no shit, Sherlock. As a whole though, the 5th generation of consoles was pretty lacking in terms of backwards compatibility. There were rumblings of Sega toying with Saturn support on the Dreamcast, and to fast forward to the 6th generation of consoles real quick, Sega even asked Microsoft about the possibility of having the original Xbox support Dreamcast titles. I mean, that would have been cool, but having a console capable of playing a completely different console's games made by a completely different manufacturer just doesn't make much sense. Moving on to the GameCube, and while the system couldn't play N64 games due to it being disc-based, it could let you play nearly all Game Boy titles, all thanks to the Game Boy Player. Slap this bad boy to the bottom of the GameCube and play Larry Boy and the Bad Apple the way God intended. Like with the Super Game Boy, this arguably doesn't count as backwards compatibility, but being able to play these games on a big screen is still really cool. The only games you couldn't play on the GameCube, however, were the motion sensor based games and all of the Game Boy Advance video cartridges purposely done to avoid piracy issues. While we're on the topic, the Game Boy Advance allowed you to play all Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on the original and SP models, which was great. See, unlike the backwards compatibility on the Color, this is actually cool because they didn't have to go out of their way to support the previous generations of handhelds, but they did anyway, and because of that, the Game Boy Advance is in a lot of ways the definitive Game Boy. They did take out the original and Color support for the Game Boy Micro, but this thing didn't sell all that well anyway, and is more of a luxury nowadays, so whatever. Basically, this is the upper classes Game Boy, and this is the Game Boy for the working man. The GBA successor to Nintendo DS could play Game Boy Advance games, but not original or Color games, and then with the DS's upgrade, the Nintendo DSi, the GBA slot was removed entirely. Why must you take away the things that make me happy, Nintendo? To be fair, I think the GBA slot was really only added to the DS as a backup measure in case the DS failed, considering it was a pretty risky idea at the time, but I don't know, it just kinda pisses me off when a model takes away features that were cool in the original. PlayStation time, the PS2 is backwards compatible with nearly all PS1 games, and when Sony shifted over to the PS3, they wanted to make it the ultimate PlayStation with PS1 and PS2 support right out of the box. And then the PS3 didn't do as well as Sony would have liked, so they started cutting PS2 support from certain models, before cutting it from all models entirely. This was always a weird decision to me. Did adding PS2 support drive up the cost so much to the point where they had to butcher it entirely? If they wanted the PS3 to become more affordable, they shouldn't have put as many damn card readers as they did the first time. It's a shame too, because this was the first time we could play these older titles in HD, and all of the PS1 and PS2 games cleaned up incredibly well. At least the PS1 was supported all throughout the PS3's life, and also with this console being produced in the age of the internet, there was an online storefront to purchase select PS2 games digitally, which was pretty nice. The Xbox 360 was backwards compatible with the original Xbox, and you know at least 46% is better than 45. This one's weird. So the Xbox 360 at launch wasn't initially backwards compatible with the original Xbox, but that all changed following an update soon after, with more and more games being added to the compatibility list as the years went by. At least they got nearly half of the original Xbox's library, but this isn't the greatest way to replay these games. Most of the compatible games have like one or two visual or technical issues due to the 360's different system architecture, but if you really want to play original Xbox games on the 360, it could have been worse. At least the Wii fully supported the GameCube with 4 controller ports and 2 memory card slots. However, with future Wii revisions, the GameCube support was completely gutted and removed entirely. I mean, it kinda makes sense. The GameCube wasn't Nintendo's greatest selling system or anything, and by the time they did revise the Wii, GameCube games weren't being sold as much in stores anymore and people stopped caring. That won't stop me from being pissed though, especially when all of the future Wii models were infinitely worse than the original. The Wii U had Wii backwards compatibility, I mean I'd hope so. Should I refer to my ice metaphor again? The Wii U handled Wii games in a kind of strange way though. To play Wii games you would have to go into Wii mode, which would essentially cause the Wii U to shut off and turn back on now in the Wii's operating system. I mean, it's not a huge deal, but I find it strange, especially when you can purchase Wii games digitally on the eShop without going into Wii mode. At least I think it does that. I never bought digital Wii games on the Wii U. The 3DS supported DS games, thank God, but as developers shifted to the 8th generation, we started to see a bump in the world of backwards compatibility. The PlayStation 4 and Xbox One were both originally set to not be backwards compatible with any prior systems, which kinda stung a bit. It made sense that companies wanted to shift to brand new architecture and thus leave their older titles in the dust, but to see this cool, albeit weirdly inconsistent tradition die out was kind of sad. It was especially saddening for the PS4. Sony put backwards compatibility into all of their systems up to that point, so to see it go was pretty disappointing. Now that didn't mean that there were no ways to play old games on new consoles. Lots of PS3 and Xbox 360 titles got remasters and definitive editions on new consoles to keep these games alive on newer hardware, and Sony even launched a service called PS Now with the sole intention being to stream PS3 games to the PS4. But backwards compatibility as it was known up till then was pretty much done for. And then Microsoft pulled one of the strangest 180s of all time. Yeah, so in 2015, Microsoft announced the Xbox One would begin to support Xbox 360 titles, and 2 years later, original Xbox titles were added as well. Do you people like backwards compatibility or not? They handled this similarly to the Xbox 360, with titles being added to the compatibility list over time, but this time they were completely going in and making sure these games could run as well as possible. The only issue is that not every game is supported, but a lot of the major ones you would most likely want to play are probably compatible. And to go one generation further, any game backwards compatible on the Xbox One is playable on the Series X, and nearly all PS4 games are supported on the PlayStation 5. The Switch has nothing. Backwards compatibility has had a really strange journey over the years. Companies seem to flip-flop all the time on whether they want to make it a standard or not, but even with everything that has been said so far, I still love backwards compatibility. I love the convenience of it, and in some cases playing these older titles on newer hardware makes it the best way to play these games. You wanna know why I keep the Wii U plugged in? It's because I can play Wii games on it, and also for Sing Party, but don't worry about that. Playing these games on a big screen or through HDMI is such a joy, and with consoles becoming even more powerful, I am very much looking forward to how companies can spruce up these older games even more. And hey, if there's a console out there that isn't backwards compatible, there are always other options, whether through official or unofficial means, to play these games through different hardware. While backwards compatibility may be underappreciated by big video game companies and by the general consumer, it'll always hold a special place in my heart.
Backwards compatibility is a really special thing that I wish would get more attention sometimes. But with that being said, I'm officially done looking backwards, and instead I'm going to look forward to life in any way I can. Basically what I'm saying is I hired a seer to hopefully predict my future, so I'll be back in a little bit. Okay, so I may have read the email wrong and accidentally stumbled into a cult meeting. Apparently they don't take so kindly to you comparing the Game Boy Color to a couple of ice cubes.